Seems like most people are here. Hello everyone, is everyone enjoying your day so far at Bell County Comic Con?
Yeah.
Woo! We have been. It's been a busy, busy day. That's a good problem to have.
Yeah, it's fantastic. This is our 5th time doing this convention in a row. It's one of the few conventions we've done in succession, all 5 years. So it's an honor to be back in Texas. To introduce ourselves, I'm Timothy Lim, this is Mark Pelligrini. We are the creators of Kamen America and Black Ops. Just to give you a little bit more of our back history, we worked in merchandising for about 10 years on various licenses through a company called We Love Fine. They recently got bought out by the Good Smile Company. So if any of you like anime and manga, you're probably aware of the Good Smile Company. They make Nendoroids and Figma figures and like either Figma or Figuarts, I forget which one. But they normally, they have control over a lot of licenses. That's our background. I actually lived here in Temple for about 5 years before moving back to Arkansas after the residency of my wife was finished. And it's always good to be back here just because it's kind of like our second home. If you look at your badges, you'll notice a bunch of characters on them, and those are all creations from Iconic Comics. Now, for those of you who weren't at this panel last year, just to give you a little bit of a brief history of Iconic Comics, it is a comic company right here in Temple, Texas. Not many people know that, but they specialize in the printing, publishing, and fulfillment of independent comics, which is it's something to be very proud of. A lot of times when you ever think of comics, you think of Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse. Those are all companies based out of big cities like New York and Los Angeles. But right here you have a grassroots comic company. And what they do is they try to find the best independent creators out there. And if they have a vision and if they have a completed work, they put it out. So all of the characters that are on your badges and featured in the brochures you got when you came in through the front doors are all Iconic Comics properties. That's the one right there. So you can actually see
as a program. So every page of that program guide has a little comic in it, and every artist in that program guide, that's the Flork. And I see that lady over there has a magnetic fork on her badge, which is awesome. We had dinner and lunch and breakfast with Mr. Flork, and he's a great guy. But he's an independent webcomic artist, and he's actually, you know his sock puppets when you see him. But he's another guy that we got here. He's down, and we're in Hall A, right?
We're in the Rotunda.
Yeah, the Rotunda. Yeah, so he's down there with us. But everybody at Iconic Comics did a page in that program. So if you go to the Iconic Comics Island in the big Rotunda and just bring your programs, everyone there will sign their page for you. And you can also find Florky's down there. And so everyone's here, and we're all indie people. And on your badges, like this badge right here, then we have the guest badge is Arc Athena. That's by Eric Canetti. And Eric Canetti's the guy who worked on a lot of stuff since the 90s.
He worked on Godzilla, Masters of the Universe. He was an artist on The Amazing Spider-Man for a while. So that guy, very humble person. This is his first time here at Bell County Comic Con. So if you want to stop by and say hello, I'm sure he'd like to hear from you. He's really shy. So sometimes we have to do some of the selling for him.
There's a program, you know.
You ask him, it's like, what have you worked on? He's like, nothing important. And then you bring up like Masters of the Universe. He's like, I worked on that a bit, but he's a really congenial person. So make sure to stop by and say hello to all of them. But what we specialize in is comics. That's essentially what we do, and we have been quite successful at it just from a growth perspective. To give a little bit of a rundown of kind of what we summarized last year, we started Kamen America in 2020.
She's the blonde girl.
She's the blonde girl who's the mascot of Bell County Comic Con. But last year, a lot of people thought, I didn't know it was a comic. I thought it was just the mascot for the show. And she is, which is flattering, but she had her roots in 2020, and we launched it right here in Temple, Texas, January of that year, and it was our runaway smash hit. We earned $20,000 on Kickstarter, and until that point, as independent creators, we really didn't make anywhere near that amount of money. And by the time we launched Kamen America 2 in the fall, we had made over $45,000. Now, as of Kamen America Volume 4 and 5, we make over 6 figures. That's not saying that we keep all that money, because obviously there's a lot of it that has to go.
We have to print those books. Yeah.
We have to print them, we have to fulfill them. We actually have a team of dedicated Beltonians and Tempellians, I don't know what you would call them.
Templars,
yeah. And they have a full warehouse in Temple, Texas, at an undisclosed location.
Yeah,
where, yeah, there. She won't tell anyone where it is though. And that's where all the books are fulfilled and sent out all across the United States and the world. But it all had to take root somewhere because we've encountered several independent artists, and they might have more pedigree than we do, like they work on big titles like Batman or whatever it might be, and yet when they have their independent comic come out, it just doesn't work. They'll put out the first book and they make a lot of money, but in the second book you see the numbers start to go down. Now for us, we're fortunate because the numbers are going up, and it's not just the monetary amount, but it's the number of readers. In our opinion, it's the readers that matter and not so much the money, because you want more people reading the book, because they'll tell people, hey, I read this book, it's really good. And part of that has to do with the storytelling. You could have the best art in the world, and I think those of you here who like comics or manga, I'm sure you've read a manga or a comic where the art is fantastic, but the story is just not there, and then you give up on it. And so I think part of the charm of it is you have to create a world and a universe where you're engaged and people want to keep reading. And we're not saying that we're experts at it, but we know a little bit about it because we have, in a way, it was kind of our task, because of Kamen America being the flagship character, taking some of the characters in the iconic universe and integrating them and thinking to ourselves, how do we make that as a whole functioning universe that people will enjoy? And so luckily, for example, at midnight tonight, our campaign with Soul Finder will end. You can actually, if you want on your phone, go on Kickstarter and look it up right now. Black Ops X Kamen America X Soul Finder. Between that and Indiegogo, we have already made over $100,000 on it, and the number is rising. We have over 2,000 backers as of around 5 a.m. this morning. And so we ask people who come to our booths, and they tell us very humbling stories. They said, you know, I gave up on comics, but last year I stopped by the booth, or I was a VIP member, and I got 2 of the books, and I was just hooked after that. And now that I'm here, I want to buy the rest of them. In fact, about 2 hours ago, we sold out of our omnibus collection.
Yeah. We had a whole case this morning, and by lunchtime it was all gone. That's,
yeah. Yeah. She has to accompany us back to the warehouse this evening, so we can hopefully see if we have more in stock. So it's been a very rewarding experience, and we learned a thing or two about building universes and crafting them. So it's going to be kind of an open forum in terms of if you have questions, so feel free to interrupt us if you have them. But when you think of universes and you think of the space, you probably think of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's probably the most popular opinion, or popular thing that people think about when they think of it. Probably second to that is the DC Universe, which is not doing as well. I mean, they kind of don't really have a unified world, which is why there's like a new Batman movie every 5 years where it's a reboot. But they claim that it's a unified world, but I think that's very questionable.
And then somewhere at the bottom is like the Universal Monsters. Yeah, shared universe. Yeah.
They all have one thing in common, at least the successful ones. So we'll take Marvel, for example. There's some things that we actually picked from there, from the way that they did their movies that we thought were really good. One is that you could tell that when those movies came out, they had a slate of them. So they already said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do Iron Man, we're going to do the Incredible Hulk, we're going to do Thor,
Iron Man 2, then Thor,
we're going to do Captain America, and then it's going to lead up to the Avengers. And so they actually had a unifying vision. It was Kevin Feige who was put in charge of that. And basically the idea was all the movies have to make sense independently. But at some point, there has to be a through line, something that connects all of them together, where it can meet up at one point, and you would actually kind of get the sensation of, oh my gosh, like whoever came up with this is a genius, because it turns out all movies are integrated. In the case of the Marvel movies, the MacGuffin was, and for those of you who don't know movie terms, the MacGuffin is the screen term for the object or the thing.
The plot device.
The plot device that everyone is after. The best example are Indiana Jones movies. It tells you right in the title what it is. Indiana Jones and, well, not
Raiders of Lost Ark.
Raiders of Lost Ark.
The Temple of Doom, they have to,
get the Sankara stones.
It was the
Holy Grail.
Yeah, the Holy Grail.
Yeah, so it's the thing that they're after. And in the Marvel movies, it was the Infinity Stones. Now, they were all called different things. Tesseract, what's the thing in Thor, like that weird ether.
Ether, yeah, that had weird names, yeah.
And then at the end, it was like, oh, it turns out they weren't just individual objects in their universes. When you put them together, they form the Infinity Gauntlet that Thanos uses in Avengers Infinity War. So a lot of that world building is stuff that we're conscious about whenever we're thinking about it. For example, in our book, we have our plot device The thing that explains powers is a particle called the chimeratons. We haven't actually said how they operate yet, but kind of when we were orchestrating all of this, we thought to ourselves, we have to have the one thing where someone might find it as just an Easter egg, but it has deeper meaning. So we would just kind of drop this term in there, and an eagle-eyed viewer would read it, and across 2 volumes or 2 separate books, they would say, wait a minute, like, that's a term that's appeared in both of them. Like, what is that? Like, how are they connected to each other?
And then you have characters who start making cameos, you know? You kind of like, you ease the reader into it. So we had chimeratons, and that was the first reference in. And then we had this character named Misha. And in the publication order, it went Kamen America 1, Black Ops 3, Kamen America 2. Misha's introduced in Black Ops 1, and Kamen America 1. In Black Ops 3, she shows up in that one, but it's in a way that it's merged with the Black Ops storyline. So if you're only reading Black Ops, you know, this character has all the context you need to understand who they are, where they're coming from, how they fit in. But if you're also reading Kamen America, you get the bigger picture as well. And that's how the Marvel movies, or really the Marvel comics, we're giving the movies almost too much credit, because the comics were doing the shared universe between all the Marvel characters for half a century before that. You go back and you read the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, comics way back in the day, you know, Spider-Man will be web slinging through it in Spider-Man number 10, going back that far, and just Thor will go flying by, like, hey, that's Thor, and then the little editor's note saying, go read Thor. You know, something like that, but you don't have to go read Thor if you don't want to. It's not, you know, imperative for understanding the Spider-Man comics. And that's kind of like the idea that we have when we do our shared universe with our comics, is that you can read Kamen America, or you can read Black Ops, and that's fine. You can understand Kamen America 1 through 5. Black Ops characters and references will be seated about, but they aren't required reading to understand the narrative of Kamen America, and vice versa with Black Ops. But if you choose to read both, then you get the bigger picture, and you see the wider world that's available.
When I was a child, my parents, they liked the fact that I read, but I think they were very well aware that there were certain comics not meant for me. So I grew up reading Spider-Man. And I remember in Spider-Man, this character named Ghost Rider would appear. And for those of you who maybe are too young or don't know, Ghost Rider is this cool guy on a motorcycle, and his head is on fire. He has a skull for a head. And he would show up in Spider-Man books, but the writer at the time, David Michelini, he wrote it in a way where when he showed up, Spider-Man would just be like, hey there, Ghosty, and Ghost Rider would be like, ah! And I just always assumed that Ghost Rider was just this wacky character that just was in Spider-Man books. I had no idea until I was a young adult that he was actually his own character in his own book, in his own universe. So that's the way that we write our books. We have 2 titles. Black Ops comes out once a year in the summer. Kamen America comes out twice a year, in the spring and the fall. You can read either title completely independent of the other, and you would understand 100% what's happening. And we see it all the time. Black Ops does not sell as well as Kamen America. It's our second bestseller, and it's because it's more of a military book, and that's fine. You can completely read that on its own and not have to read Kamen America. Going back to like the Marvel titles and to DC to a certain extent, one thing that those comics do try to do is they try to sell more books. And so eventually what happens is you do have this kind of business model where it's like, no. You can't just have Ghost Rider appear and be part of Spider-Man's world. You have to put the editor's note where it's like, hey, if you want to know that weird reference, you need to read like Ghost Rider number 21. I think that was good for sales because it makes people want to read it, but eventually it gets confusing because people are like, wait a minute, I'm already spending like $5 for a comic book, and finances are tight. I really don't want to use my allowance to buy more comics. I just want to know what's happening in the story. I think to a degree, some of that's happening in the Marvel universe. There were interviews with Kevin Feige early on where he essentially said, all of our movies are standalone. You can read them completely, you can watch them on their own, and you don't have to worry about any crossovers or anything like that. Well, I think it's gotten to the point where you kind of do. My wife and I were watching some Disney Plus movies recently, and I just thought, if you didn't watch that Disney Plus series before, you're not going to know what's going to happen.
Scarlet Witch was a bad guy.
You spoiled it.
I'm getting ahead of you.
You spoiled it.
Okay.
And if you haven't seen it, in the Doctor Strange movie that just came out, it's on Disney Plus now, there's a character who I will not mention, who is the bad guy in the show, or in the movie, but I thought, my gosh, if you didn't see like the Disney Plus series, you would have
If you're going just from one movie to the other, it's like, wait, when did they turn into the bad guy? Like, oh, I had to go watch a TV series to know that. And in comics, we're doing that too. There's a difference between Thor popping up, you know, in a panel or a guest appearance in Spider-Man and helping Spider-Man with Spider-Man's plot. It's different when at the end of an issue of Spider-Man it says, if you wanted to know the rest of the story, you have to go read this issue of Thor. There was a really bad time in the 90s where Spider-Man had 5 separate titles, and each one was a chapter in a storyline, and you had to read all 5 Spider-Man books, or you couldn't understand anything. Because if you just read Amazing Spider-Man number 578, you couldn't just go read 579. You had to go read 4 other books in between. And that's when it gets out of control, and your shared universe becomes cumbersome, and it becomes financially unreasonable for most customers. And the alternative is like what we do, where you can read Kamen America, you can read Black Ops, and there's other books too that Iconic publishes, such as Soulfinder. And that's the crossover that we're doing right now on Kickstarter. The pre-orders end today. That one is Black Ops, Kamen America, Soulfinder. And the Soulfinder characters are showing up in the book, but we give you all the context you need so that you don't have to go read Soulfinder if you don't want to, or if you want to go read it later, that's fine. But all the information you need is within the narrative of that crossover so that you can just pick it up and read it and be fine. Without doing something sketchy that Marvel and DC does, like, oh, well, if you want to have any chance of understanding this, you got to go read 5 other books and pay us for 5 other books. And that's something that's almost unfair to the reader, to the customer, and it's something we try to avoid doing. In terms of movies, because we're talking about that, I talk about the Universal Monsters, the classic Monsters franchises. Universal has tried 3 times in the past 15 years to launch their Universal Monster Cinematic Universe. And the first time was with Van Helsing, with that Hugh Jackman movie. Not very good. It felt like trailers for a bunch of other movies, because it's got the Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula, the Invisible Man, and Mr. Hyde all popping up in one movie, and it's just too much in one movie. And it's like, well, we're going to launch them all in their own splinter movies. It's like, that's too much. And then they tried Dracula Untold, and that was just a bad movie. And so that one didn't work. So they tried again with The Mummy, and it was just trailers for other movies all throughout that movie. It's like, how about you just make a good Mummy movie instead, And that's kind of the attitude you should have. If you want people to follow your universe of comics, the best foundation is with a good movie, or a good comic in this case, a good comic first, and then once people trust that you can tell stories, that you have strong characters and a strong narrative, then they may be interested in checking out what else you have to offer and what the other collaborators you have to offer if it's interesting.
It was interesting to me having read comics my whole life and then watching those movies, because I would watch them with, normies, like people who don't read comics, because I wanted to see what their reaction would be. Because in my opinion, it's like, to have that successful movie template, you have to be accessible to everyone. I mean, don't get me wrong, we have a lot of friends who are really big into comics, and they get into a lot of debates where they're like, I didn't like that movie because he was wearing a t-shirt instead of a polo shirt. And I'm like, what? Like, that's such a tiny nitpick. But in the comics, he was wearing a polo shirt. I'm like, that is such a nitpick that you have to understand that they're trying to have it accessible to everyone. And I remember watching those movies early on, the stinger at the end of, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was The Incredible Hulk, is the one where they introduced Nick Fury in the post-credit scene.
Was it Iron Man?
Iron Man?
Yeah, Iron Man had...
yes, in Incredible Hulk, it was the shield.
It was Robert Downey Jr. shows up at a bar.
Oh, at the bar, right. Yeah. But when the first time Nick Fury shows up, he says, well, my name is Nick Fury, and I wanted to talk to you about the Avengers Initiative. If you're a comic book fan, you're like, that's crazy, like he showed up, like it's really gonna be happening. But if you're a moviegoer who doesn't read comics, you're like, okay, his name is Nick Fury, and he has the Avengers Initiative. But it's not taking away from the experience. You're just thinking to yourself like, okay, well, they've set us up for the next movie, and there's gonna be a character named Nick Fury, and he has a thing called the Avengers Initiative. We do kind of the same thing with our worlds too. Like he was saying, you don't want it to be a lot of trailers basically blasting you and saying like, hey, here's this new character from this other book, there's this other character from the other book. One way that we encourage young creators or creators in general to make their world is, one, the world has to exist in your mind even if it's not on paper. So for example, for all of our characters, we know really dumb details like shoe size, favorite color, what they like to eat, where they like to eat, what time they wake up, what they like to have for breakfast. It's things that like readers will never know. They'll never know it, but it's kind of our ace in the hole because the world exists. And then after that, what we're showing y'all is the very tiny portion of that world. But it's good because we set it up in a way where if we want to introduce those elements outside of it, we can bring them in. For example, so Kamen America is a very lighthearted book. It's about a very young businesswoman who doesn't want to be a superhero. She wants to be a fashion designer, but she ends up being in a cosmic accident. She gets these powers, and she's like, well, I can rebrand myself. I'm going to be a patriotic superhero. But she finds out that you can't beat everything with just your fists, because you end up having like weird media people. You have the paparazzi. You have these kind of jerks, real-life villains who you can't just tackle with your fists or with lightning powers or whatever. So she finds out, kind of in a weird irony, that doing what's right is a lot of times not what's fashionable. You have to be able to mediate the two. So it's a very lighthearted book. Now, our friend Douglas Ernst, he writes a book called Soul Finder, and the plot is it's about combat military exorcists. So it's about Vatican-approved Catholic exorcist priests who have had combat experience. Believe it or not, like, it's happened. We've actually met people who are chaplains who have seen combat and they decide to become priests later on. So a lot of his work is very research-based. He does his due diligence. He's former military too, nice guy. But we had met in Orlando about 3 years ago, 2019. We just happened to be in Orlando, and he said, I want to get this book off the ground, and we met. And at the time, we kind of laughed about it, and it was like, could you imagine a time when we cross over? And I said, not right now. Like it can't congeal in my head because it's so different. His book is very serious, whereas our book is very lighthearted. But we put the groundwork in it because there's a scene in the first book where our character is wearing a t-shirt and it says Steepleton on it. Steepleton is the city where his book takes place. So where I got that idea was, this is showing my age. I remember being in the movie theater watching Batman Forever, and there's a part where Val Kilmer, who plays Bruce Wayne, he's telling Robin, he says, are you really going to leave? Metropolis is 70 miles away. And I just remember being like, my gosh, like they're setting up for like Superman. And so in my head, I thought, wow, they really thought this out. Like they're going to plan for this to happen. And sure enough, we put that in there. So it's like, it exists through the transitive property, and maybe someday it'll happen. But what we did was we just ended up doing the groundwork where we said, it's going to take a while, and it took us 6 volumes. So it took us 6 volumes and 3 years, but we got to that point. And we got to the point to where when we announced it, people weren't shocked. They were like, it would be like me trying to pitch to you like Sesame Street versus Godzilla, and you're like, that's never going to happen. But Barney versus Godzilla. But then it's like, no, because if you look at Barney episode 1, like they make a reference to like the great monster seen out off the coast.
Super they reference Super Grover, so he's going to be fighting Godzilla
right.
at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there are these things that get set up, and we're not the first ones to do it. For example, Archie's met the Punisher, like, and it's a good book. You can actually find it in those bargain bins, and it's because like the writing is set up where when you read it, you're like, yeah, I can believe this. Yeah, Punisher comes to Riverdale and he's trying to, I don't know, shoot drug dealers or whatever. So everything is established in a way where it has to be organic to the main storyline or the main through line. If it ends up sounding like product placement, where, for example, if in our book she's doing something and she's like, oh yeah, you know what I really like? I like combat veteran exorcists, and it's like a wink to the audience where it's like, buy more Coca-Cola, buy more popcorn. That's not what you want. You want it so that the universe comes organically. There was, it's happened several times, but the one thing that stays in my mind is there was a group of independent creators, and they were all very successful. But then they said, we're going to do a team up. And each of them had only put out 1 book by that time. And that team up book did not do good. And the reason why is, I'm sure that the story is probably good. I know the art is good because I know the artist. But they weren't ready for it, because I think most people were like, whoa, you gotta calm down. Like, in a way, a team looks like a marriage. It's like, this is just the first date. Like, we can't...
The characters didn't have any chemistry because the characters were only 1 book. They only existed for 1 book, so the characters themselves didn't have a lot of depth to them yet. Give yourself like 6 volumes. Your characters have a history, they have a depth, they have a personality, and that informs how your character will play off somebody else's character and vice versa. You have to know your character, and they have to know their character before you can understand their dynamics. And if every character plays off each other differently and it feels organic, like for instance, we have our character Carly. Carly is Catholic. It's just a part of her background, it's just a part of who she is, part of her history. That's part of introducing the Soul Finder characters, who are, combat veteran exorcists commissioned by the Vatican. They show up, 6 volumes later into Kamen America, and they aren't necessarily tied into the fact that Carly is Catholic. It's almost just a coincidence. They just both happen to be Catholic, but that informs an element of their relationship and their dynamic together. And so that's things that they could talk about and have in common. And that's when Father Redder from Soulfinder mentions that the plot device is a first-class holy relic, Carly knows exactly what he's talking about because that's vernacular she understands as a Catholic, that sort of thing. And that's what we talk about when we say, like, know that what your character's favorite food is, know what your character's shoe size is, know those things about your character because you can utilize them later on and to keep your character consistent. Whenever I script any of our books, I know who the cartoon voice actor in my head is for our characters. Carly is voiced in my head when I script her by Jennifer Hale, doing the voice similar to the one she did for Sam from Totally Spies. You know, it's a show from 15 years ago. It's like nobody else in the world is going to know that, but it means that when I'm scripting the character, her voice is consistent in my head. We have a villain. He's voiced in my head by the late David Warner. And when I write that villain's dialogue, I listen to it in my head. Does it sound like something David Warner would say? Like, no, then I rewrite it. Yes, then I keep it. And the reader doesn't necessarily know that David Warner is the voice of this villain, but the reader will interpret the consistency of the character's voice and the things he says and how he says them. And that character will feel more consistent, more organic, and more realistic. Even if the reader gives the character a completely different voice, they'll still subliminally and subconsciously understand and recognize the consistency. And that's all part of things you should do when you're scripting your characters so they feel more alive and more realistic. Think about how when you read a Batman comic, you're probably reading it with Kevin Conroy's voice in the Batman the Animated Series Batman. And so Batman's dialogue will always sound consistent in your head, unless it doesn't sound like something Kevin Conroy would say. And that's going to take you like way out of the experience.
A better example, because for people who might be really young in here, just who's the last Batman? I haven't watched the latest one. Let's just say Christian Bale. Most people here have seen The Dark Knight. So it's kind of like, you know how they make fun of his voice because he changes. He's always like, I'm Batman. Imagine if, so you have that voice in your head, you're like, that's what Batman sounds like. Imagine if he said something like, I don't like nachos. Like, you know that's not part of the character because that's not what he sounds like. And so when you're writing it, you have to have that voice in your head because it will keep you from tonally saying to yourself, like, I don't think that that's how he should sound like.
I was reading a book, it was Thundercats versus Masters of the Universe. It's this crossover between two 80s Saturday morning cartoons. And it was drawn by a really great artist, Freddie Williams. And the art was fantastic. I don't recall who the writer was, because I didn't make it a point to look up who the writer was because I didn't like the way he wrote the characters, because you're intuitively reading your Thundercats characters, your Thundercats cartoon voice